U.S. Census Bureau. Go ahead, Andy.
Great. Thank you so much, Charles. So thank you all for taking time out of your busy day to attend this session today on the last of 3 days. So again, my name is Andy Haight. I'm an economist at the Census Bureau. And today in my hour, if we could have everybody maybe mute your phone, that would be perfect. Thank you so much. So anyway, in my session today, I'm going to be talking about 3 things. First, I'm going to provide a pretty quick overview of where we are with the release of the data from the 2017 Economic Census. We have just recently completed all of our local area data, and I'll talk a little bit about some findings for the state of Oregon, and then we'll also talk about what's coming after this local area data was completed. Then I'll spend a bit of time and do a quick demo of a data resource that we launched back in April called the COVID-19 Data Hub. I'm sure by now we are all sick of that 5-letter acronym, but being a good federal employee, I, of course, need to tell you about what we're doing to provide information about COVID-19 and how the country is recovering from the pandemic. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the last third or so of my session will be a demo of our Census Business Builder data tool. Some of you who have heard me present before probably have heard me talk about CBB. I am the project lead and manager for the Census Business Builder data tool, and we've recently made some pretty substantial updates to the tool that you may not be familiar with, so I figured I would walk through those. So to get us started, I always like to use this slide that talks a little bit about sort of who we are. What is the U.S. Census Bureau? As I'm sure all of you know, we are in the process of collecting the data from the 2020 population census. But as important as the decennial census is, and yes, it is the most important thing that we do at the Census Bureau, it is certainly not the only thing that we do. In fact, we conduct 138, to be exact, monthly, quarterly, and annual censuses, surveys, and other kinds of programs. They include the decennial census and the American Community Survey, which I'm sure many of you are already very familiar with. The ACS is a fabulous resource of demographic, socioeconomic, and housing data. Provides statistics down to the census tract and even the block group level, and really is an invaluable resource for businesses trying to understand their potential customers, community planners trying to understand the demographics and the needs of the people that live in their areas, and a wide variety of other users. The part of the Census Bureau that I work in, though, is the part that does our 58 business surveys. Every 5 years, we conduct an economic census done on the years ending with 2 and 7. So 2017 is our latest economic census. 2022 will be the next one. Those 5-year economic censuses are also partnered with a 5-year census of governments that publishes data on the nature and scope of the state and local government sectors. In fact, we just released today a report from one of our annual public sector programs that talks about the importance of public sector in terms of employment. Who are the workers that work for state and local government? So it was an interesting release. Those 58 business surveys are sort of best visualized, I think, by this pyramid. And I love using a pyramid as a way to visualize the business surveys that we conduct at the Census Bureau, because the pyramid shows 2 things. First, it shows hierarchy, how the monthly and quarterly surveys are hierarchically related to the annual programs, which are hierarchically related to the economic census. If we did not do a comprehensive economic census every 5 years, The monthly and quarterly and annual surveys, which are sample surveys, would not be an accurate survey. How can you do a survey when you don't know who all the businesses are to sample from? So it's very important that we do an economic census. The pyramid also, though, does speak to the level of data, the detail that is shown. Our monthly and quarterly surveys are certainly the most timely things we do. If you were to have looked at the data on the monthly retail trade survey that was released for April, you would see the beginnings of how the pandemic was impacting retail and the accommodation and food services sector. And if you then looked at the data for May and June, you would have been horrified to see how much that entire important part of our U.S. economy just took a dive. It was like driving off a cliff. The retail and accommodation and food services sector just took a horrid beating, which I'm sure many of you are experiencing in your own communities. But those monthly and quarterly surveys, as timely as they are pretty limited in terms of the detail. Most of those surveys are only shown at the national level, where the economic census gives you much more detailed data. So let's talk a little bit more about that. What is the economic census? What does it include? So the economic census covers nearly every 2 through 6 digit North American Industry Classification System, or NAICS code. There are a couple of exclusions. We do not publish data on farms, on ranching, on aquaculture, basically almost all the activities that are classified under NAICS Code 11. Those we do not publish at the Census Bureau because the U.S. Department of Agriculture does through their National Statistical Service. National Agricultural Statistics Service. It's one of those days. There's also a few other exclusions, though. We do not publish data on colleges and universities because the National Center for Education Statistics does. We don't publish data on railroads because the Department of Transportation does. So there are a few exclusions, and I've included a link to a list of all those exclusions in here on this slide. As I think my colleague Heidi may have mentioned to you, the slides are going to be made available to you, so you don't need to frantically write down that URL or any of the other URLs in the presentation. The economic census is also our most detailed economic program in terms of geography. For the state of Oregon, we publish data not only at the state level and metro areas, but also by counties and by places. Places is the term that we use to talk about cities, towns, villages, and boroughs. And in the economic census, we use a 2,500 population cutoff. So that means that small towns in Oregon, as long as they had at least 2,500 population, they would be eligible for dissemination in the economic census. Now, just because an area is eligible for publication doesn't mean that the data may actually be published. As you all, I'm sure, know, the Census Bureau is bound by Title 13 of the U.S. Code that says that we cannot publish data that would disclose the identity of individual businesses. So, for example, let's say Charles and I owned the only 2 gas stations in our little town in Oregon. The Census Bureau could not publish data on gas stations because I could easily subtract my employment and my payroll and my sales from the total and know exactly how much Charles pays his employees. I'm sure way more than I do. So we can't do that. And suppression of data does get to be a big deal when you start looking at smaller levels of geography. So for those of you who have already started to browse through some of the economic census data by place, you will have, I'm sure, noticed that there are some cities and towns in Oregon where we have very little data, and others where we have tons of data because there are so many more businesses in those other areas. Now, in terms of the other dimensions other than NAICS and geography, the economic census is also our most detailed program. We publish 4 different breakouts on business size. So if you're interested in data on establishments, individual business locations that have less than 5 employees, we have that data. If you're interested in data on companies that have less than $1 million in sales, so company size by revenue size, we have that data too. And we even have statistics like franchise status, class of customers, a wide variety of other statistics, and we'll actually talk about that in just a moment. The Economic Census is also our most detailed program in terms of the data variables that are shown. For the entire Economic Census, all sectors, all industries, we publish data on number of establishments, employment, payroll, and some measure of output. That measure of output can be sales, it can be shipments, it can be receipts, it can be revenue, it can be work done. But in the end, all 5 of those are ways of measuring what a business produces. But in addition to those 4 basic statistics, we also publish dozens, if not hundreds, of other data variables that are unique to specific sectors or industries. So, for example, in the manufacturing sector, we publish detailed data on inventories and capital expenditures and assets and depreciation and purchase services, a wide variety of things like that. One thing else that is unique to the Economic Census is the product lines data. In addition to publishing those total sales statistics by industry, we take those sales numbers and break them out into the individual products and services that the business produces or sells. So, for example, let's say you were interested in understanding what are the different products and services sold by grocery stores. Our regular sales data would give you total statistics, data on the total sales of grocery stores. But if you wanted to find out how much of those sales was for produce or for meat and poultry products or for canned goods or for baked goods or for tobacco products, those detailed breakouts are published in what we call our product lines table. And for the 2017 Economic Census, our product data is going through a substantial transformation, a substantial change, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then finally, in terms of where you can go to get these data from the Economic Census, for the first time, we are now disseminating all of our Economic Census on the new data.census.gov platform. I know some of you probably miss the good old-fashioned American Fact Finder tool that we had for 15 years. Data.census.gov is sort of right now in the same position as AFF was in 1997 when it was first born. So it's kind of like history repeating itself. So it does have some challenges today, but I will tell you from having worked on the team that helped come up with the functional requirements, high-level functional requirements for data.census.gov, the capabilities that are being built into this platform that will be available there someday will be much greater than what we've ever had in American Fact Finder. Economic Census data are also have just been added to Census Business Builder, and you'll see that in just a moment too. Now this slide talks about the release of the data. Because the Economic Census is our most comprehensive and detailed program, it takes us a long time to get the data out. We started releasing data in September of last year, and just in August, we actually completed what we call our geographic area statistics. This is where you get all of that rich county and place and metro level data for Oregon. So if you want to look at the manufacturing sector in the state and you want to be able to drill down to metros and counties, you can do that using these geographic area statistics. As you can probably notice, that series was scheduled to be completed in November. We actually completed it in August, so I'm really happy that we got caught up a little. But I will tell you, we are about 9 months behind where we were at the same time during the 2012 Economic Census. Some budget challenges that we had and a government shutdown really conspired to affect our data release by quite a bit, so we're about 9 months behind. Now, as we were flowing those local area data out, as we started releasing them in January and they were being flowed out on a state-by-state, sector-by-sector basis, we wanted to be able to have a tool that would allow users to be able to see at a glance what data were available for their state. So we created a little visualization that you see over here on the right-hand side. The link to it is in the upper left-hand corner of the slide. And what this visualization shows is a hex map of the United States. You can see Oregon is sort of in a weird position. It's sort of southwest of Idaho, which I guess is sort of right, sort of not really right. But what was nice about this visualization is you could then tell at a glance what data have been released for Oregon. Now, as you can see, looking at this graphic, we've now completed the release. It's 100%. So you may be thinking, well, why would I care about this thing anymore? The visualization is still useful because it allows you to jump right to the data that you're interested in data.census.gov. So sticking with my example, let's say you were interested in researching the manufacturing sector in Oregon. You could choose manufacturing from the little sector menu here in the visualization where it says select a sector from this menu. If we could choose manufacturing, the map would refresh and would show all the states that we have released manufacturing data for, which Oregon, of course, would be one of them. And if you then went ahead and clicked on the hex for Oregon, you could then click on a link that would bring you right to the manufacturing data for Oregon. It's a really nice little shortcut to get to the data without having to kind of make your way through all the data.census.gov menus. So I would encourage you guys to bookmark this and use it as just a shortcut to get to the data. Now, when we conduct the economic census, we bundle up all of the changes that have occurred since the previous economic census and we apply them in the new economic census. So in the 5-year period between 2012 and 2017, a lot happened. Geographic areas changed. The boundaries of counties and places in metropolitan areas change on a regular basis. So we have data that we published that shows information about those changes. One tip I will share with you, and this is sort of me standing on my soapbox a little tiny bit. Anytime you are comparing data over time, you should always make sure that the thing that you are comparing is comparable. I have talked to dozens, if not hundreds, of data users over the years who are doing a 5 or 10-year comparison of how their county or how their city has economically changed over that 5 or 10-year period, and were unaware, or maybe blissfully unaware, that the boundaries of the city that they're comparing had changed, that city had had an annexation and some land has been added to the boundary of that city, or maybe they had a de-annexation. Some land was given off to a neighboring city or town. Those boundary changes are important when you're doing comparisons because you have to know, is the thing you're comparing comparable? In addition to those changes, we've also dropped the zip code level data that we used to publish in the economic census. Some of you may be saying, oh no, that's such a bummer. I really like the zip code data. Fear not, it's not really a big deal because our county business patterns program every year publishes data called zip code business patterns. So when my colleagues first asked, Andy, is anybody going to mind that we drop the zip code data from the economic census? My answer was no, because honestly, in 30 years of working at the Census Bureau, I have never sent a data user to the economic census zip code data because I've always had more timely annual zip code data available from county business patterns. A bit of a bummer for Oregon, though, is the drop of the place level data for manufacturing. The most detailed we go down to for the manufacturing sector is now county, and the single biggest reason for this is the second to last bullet at the end of this one slide. We have been required, this census, to adopt some new disclosure rules that were dictated to the Census Bureau by one of our agency partners that we receive data from that acts as a proxy for non-response business data, the IRS. They are now requiring us to suppress data that we used to be able to publish. Those disclosure rules are impacting the data that we're publishing for the economic census and our other business programs. And because of those additional suppressions, we decided to not try to publish the place level data for manufacturing. I am hopeful that in time for the 2022 Economic Census that this will be addressed and we will be able to start publishing more of this, but we will see. Now, in terms of those geography changes, this slide just provides a little bit of information about sort of the scope of those changes. In the 5-year period between 2012 and 2017, none of the metropolitan areas in Oregon changed, so it is totally fine to compare data from 2012 to 2017 at the metro area levels and know that you're comparing apples to apples. However, 137 of the economic places that we published in the Economic Census changed. Some of them gained area, some of them lost area, none actually had name change. There were 7 new places, which are shown over on the right-hand side, and 2 places that dropped. The usual reason why places are added or dropped is because of population change. Sisters City likely had a population increase where the number of people that lived there that was below 2,500 in 2012 must have risen above 2,500, and now we're able to publish data specifically for the city of Sisters, Oregon, in Deschutes County. That data is now available. Same thing on the dropped side. Myrtle Point City probably shed some population, either due to just normal population decline or maybe because they had a boundary change, and so the people that lived in that area are no longer part of Myrtle Point. So you see that sometimes. I really like what I hear people have bookmarked, this geographies page that we have in the upper right-hand corner. This is where you can go in and get the full list of what are those 79 places that gained area, what are the 50 places that lost area. In addition to these text-based, table-based displays of geo notes, et cetera, we also have an application called TigerWeb Econ. There's a link to it at the bottom of the slide where you can go in and look at those changes on a map. So you can make the decision. Is that boundary change significant to me? Do I need to be worried about that and say the data aren't comparable? Or is that boundary change so small that I'm willing to say, you know what, close enough, we're going to call it comparable. We give those materials to you so you can make those changes. And I tell people, you should be using these resources whether you're using Census Bureau data or other data, because in the end, these boundary changes affect every data set that's published at the local area levels. Now, as I mentioned, the classification system also changes. NAICS changes every 5 years, and these 2 slides provide a very brief summary of what are the 6 sectors that were impacted by the change and what are the industries that changed themselves. I'm not going to really take the time to go through each of these. I have provided a link to our NAICS website where you can go in and read more. But these changes, there are recodes, cases where the content of that industry did not change, but the code did. So, for example, under retail trade, all other general merchandise stores, the code for that industry changed between 2012 and 2017. So the data are comparable, it's just a different code. The green highlighted cases are ones where we've combined industries. So, for example, under manufacturing, we took separate codes for household cooking, household refrigeration, household laundry, and other major household appliance manufacturing. And those 4 industries have now been combined into one NAICS code for major household appliance manufacturing. Usually, the reason why codes are combined like this is either due to industry decline, where those industries have reduced to such a point that we can no longer separately publish data for cooking appliances, refrigeration, laundry, and other. That happens to be the case with this particular example. If any of you have ever gone recently shopping for a household appliance and happened to look at the label on where that appliance was manufactured, you will notice that unless you are shopping in a high-end store looking for Viking ranges and other really higher-end appliances, nearly every household cooking, refrigeration, and laundry machine is not made in the United States. There's actually very few. There are some cases where the industries have been consolidated, not due to decline, but because the number of companies that are engaged in that activity have decreased, or they have merged to such a point that we can no longer separately collect that data. So that's sort of the example with electronic shopping, electronic auctions, and mail order houses under retail trade. Those have been combined because the same companies are involved in all three of those industries, and now we can no longer separately publish the data for them. This slide covers the last three sectors: information, real estate, and the professional, scientific, and technical services. And under this last sector, professional, scientific, and technical, this is the only sector that has a truly brand new industry. For the first time, we are now publishing data on R&D in nanotechnology. And this happens to be an industry that is present in Oregon and has grown to the point that we can now actually publish data for this industry. To get access to these data, these are the three main tools that you can use to get those data. Data.census.gov, of course, is the most important of these. You really need to be versed in how to use this tool. I would encourage you to check it out if you haven't already. The Economic Census data was just recently added to QuickFacts, and it was also added to Census Business Builder. Now, this slide here, very, very briefly, just provides a couple of key findings for the state of Oregon. I actually did a much more comprehensive webinar about including more findings for Oregon a couple of weeks ago or months ago. The recorded copy of that is available on our training website, and I would encourage you guys to check it out. But as you can see, wholesale trade, as is the case in many states, is the largest sector in Oregon. But what is quite interesting is construction, manufacturing, wholesale, and retail are all really big sectors in terms of growth in sales in that 5-year time frame. In most other states, wholesale and retail are the ones that grew the most, and then third ranked was the healthcare sector. But in Oregon, the construction and manufacturing sector have actually grown quite a bit in that 5-year period, so you can see how prevalent, how much of a growth that they have been. Now, you will notice that there are three sectors in these two charts that don't have a bar shown: utilities, information, and the finance and insurance sectors. We do not publish data at the state level for the 2-digit NAICS for those three sectors. Data are available for the more detailed NAICS codes, but at the 2-digit level, they're not there. So it is possible that the information in finance sectors could have also seen substantial increases, but of the published ones, this is what we have. Now, since we've completed the local area data, here's just a very brief summary of what's coming next. Those product lines data that we talked about earlier are now being published as part of our North American Product Classification System, or NAPS codes. Those data are scheduled for release on November 19th. And I would encourage you all to sort of set a date in your calendar for that date. We will be doing an announcement when the data get released. I'm actually going to be conducting a webinar on December 1st on the new NAPS data, and the announcement about that will be available up on our training website. I think Heidi may have just posted a note about where you can go to see those recordings and get that information, and it'll give you a really good comparison between the product lines data published in 2012 and how different it now is for 2017, and specifically how to access it in data.census.gov. Also in November, we will be releasing those size tables that I talked about. The data will mostly come out in November, but there's some that will flow into the beginning of next year. And then finally next year, we will finish off with our last tables, the miscellaneous subjects tables. Now, when we think about the economic census, historically there has been another program that has been released along with the economic census that people really liked, the Survey of Business Owners. SBO, as we like to call it, published information on the race, ethnicity, gender, and veteran status of the business owner. and it was conducted every 5 years, on the same years as we did the Economic Census. People really loved it because it showed the importance, or not, of women-owned business, minority-owned business in certain industries and in certain geographies. It really helps make the case for encouraging these groups to open their own businesses, because it gave information that allowed users to compare the percent Hispanic, let's say, in a particular county to the percent Hispanic-owned businesses in the county. When you saw a big gap between those two numbers, it made you wonder, well, why is it that Hispanics are not opening more businesses in a particular county when there is such a large percentage of the population there? Now, as great as SBO was, people bemoaned that it was only available every 5 years. So we've recently released something called the Annual Business Survey that, as the name implies, is an annual series that publishes data very similar to SBO. It is similar, but it is not the same. And there's one or two marked differences that I need to remind you all of. Where SBO published data for both employer and non-employer businesses, self-employed people, ABS only covers employer businesses. Now, before you start crying, there are plans to eventually expand the ABS to add back in the non-employer businesses, because as many of you know, there are way more self-employed minority and women-owned businesses than there are employer minority and women-owned businesses, for example. Same thing on the veteran side as well. So not having the non-employer data really is sort of a bummer. There are plans to add it back in. I'm not sure when that's actually going to happen. The other difference between ABS and SBO is in terms of the level of geography and industry published. Both programs publish data down to the place level, but in ABS, we are only publishing data at the 2-digit NAICS sector level for metros, counties, and places, where at the national and state level, you get the full NAICS breakout. So you can go in and see how many women-owned daycare centers are there in Oregon, but you wouldn't be able to get the data specifically for daycare centers in Multnomah County. So just to kind of give you an example. Now, let's change gears and talk a little bit about COVID. As the pandemic was starting and was beginning to really spread, the Census Bureau recognized that we had a lot of data that policymakers and others could use to help understand what the potential impacts of the pandemic might be, both in terms of vulnerable populations and businesses and in terms of actual impact. And one of the first programs that we started seeing the impact of the pandemic was in a data product that we tabulate every single month but only published once a year, called Business Formation Statistics. Business Formation Statistics is basically published from data that we receive from the Internal Revenue Service. So if Andy decided he was tired of working at the Census Bureau and I wanted to form my own consulting business, one of the first steps that I would do when I'm forming my business is I would contact the IRS and said, I need an employer identification number because I actually want to report my business on the payroll tax form rather than on the good old 1040 Schedule C or Schedule SE. Well, when I apply for that business application through the IRS to get that EIN, the IRS informs the Census Bureau, hey, Andy Haight decided he wants to open a business. Here's his EIN. And we use that information to update our business register, the complete universe of every business in the United States, and also to tabulate every year as part of the business formation statistics. How many startups were there in 2018, 2019? Well, when we started seeing a marked decline in business applications in March and April, we realized that we could take that data that we are regularly getting from the IRS, and instead of waiting for you all to see it until the end of the year, we would start releasing it weekly. So this is a great resource to be able to see how startups were impacted at the national, state, and regional levels throughout the pandemic. And what I think you would notice if you looked at it is where the startups really took a beating in March and April and May, they've now begun to rebound. In fact, in August, the startups basically far surpassed where they were last year because businesses are getting caught back up again. They weren't going to start up in February or March or April, but now that we are beginning the recovery from the pandemic, now they're ready to get started. So this is a great resource. I've included the links to both the visualization on the right, the link is at the bottom of the page, and the link to the BFS main page just above there. Now, we also have a household pulse survey and a small business pulse survey. I know both of those surveys were covered last week in another presentation that you all had, so I won't cover those. And the fourth program that we conducted was something called the Community Resilience Estimates, which I'm hoping will grow to be a program that will live not only throughout the COVID pandemic, but also be a very useful program beyond COVID. Understanding how resilient communities are to shocks is very important if you're a policymaker, if you are an emergency manager, or if you're someone who works in economic development. Knowing how risky a particular community might be to a particular shock. If you think about two communities that have a very similar number of people that work there, but one of those communities, 80% of the population of the workers actually work in one industry. There's one main employer in that community. Whereas in another community with a very similar number of workers, those workers are evenly distributed across 30 or 40 or 50 different industries. That first community, one could argue, is much less resilient than the second one because if that one business were to close, that community is now had a major impact. Well, the same thing is true on the demographic side. There are communities that have a very large percentage of older people who are disabled or who have other kind of challenges. The resilience of that community, it might be very different than a community that's mostly younger couples with young children. So Community Resilience Estimates was specifically created for COVID, but it'll live beyond there. Now, because of all of this great data that we have, we realized that making users go to individual pages to find the data was going to be mean. So that what we needed to do instead was bring them to one place where they could go to actually view that data all in one repository. So the COVID-19 Hub was what was created, and right now I'm going to go ahead and actually show you very quickly the COVID-19 Hub. I know we're getting close to my end of my time. So I'm going to go ahead. We click on Emergency Management. This right now is where the Hub lives. We then scroll down, choose the coronavirus COVID pandemic icon, and then click on this icon over here. And now we come to our COVID resource page. From there, we then click on the Data Hub, and that then brings us to the actual COVID-19 Hub. Now, on this hub are a couple of things. At the very top, we have 4 basic statistics, pretty boring, if you will. Below there, we have something called the Impact Report. This is a 2-page dashboard that allows users to look at some key demographic and business data at the county and state levels. So if I scroll down and choose Oregon from the menu, the dashboard is now going to repaint, and we're going to see some basic statistics on population, 65 and over. We have some basic business data. We have health insurance coverage. We have some poverty data, some other at-risk categories. And then on the second page, we have a ton more data on language spoken at home and Hispanic origin, school enrollment, and health insurance coverage. So it's a nice place to see some basic statistics at the state level. And of course, we can then go in and choose a particular county. Let's choose Columbia County, just since it's up here toward the top of the list. And now the application is now going to refresh, and we're going to be looking at data specifically for Columbia County, Oregon. Now, this dashboard was designed primarily for people to be able to view online. You, of course, can print it off, and you can download the data. But we also provided direct access to the data in a few other places. Here is where we have information from those 4 specific COVID-related programs. BFS and Small Business Pulse have their own dashboard here in the hub, whereas Household Pulse and CRE currently just have go-to links to jump out to those program pages so you can access the data there. We are actually in the process of building dashboards specifically for these other 2 programs. Below there, we have something that we call the policy maps. There are 8 maps here that let you go in and look at specific statistics. So if we were interested in populations that have less than $75,000 worth of household income, we can pan this map. I can now zoom in on the state of Oregon, and once I zoom in enough, it'll switch over to county level data, and I can keep zooming to look down to census tracts. All of this data that is in this hub was put in the hub for us by Esri, and they have incorporated all of this data into their Living Atlas. So if any of you are GIS professionals or have GIS folks that work in your offices, they can go ahead and access these data and incorporate these already created layers right in their own work. Finally, below there are access to 5 highlighted data sets, as well as a full categorical data set search that again gives you access to all of the raw data in a CSV, Excel, and data layer format. So already built into ArcGIS for you. In between these 2 options, the categorical data sets and the highlighted data sets, we are in the process right now of working with FEMA to add data from about 40 other data sets and have this become a portal to a wide variety of other federal, state, and private sector data related to COVID-19. FEMA right now makes access to this data that they have through a portal that the Argonne National Lab folks created, but it's password protected. So you need to have access, and they'll limit access to that Argonne site. They were very impressed with what we had done with this page, and they said, would you guys be willing to put our 42 data sets on your page? And we said, sure. So I'm now going to jump back out over to my PowerPoint file, and I want to very quickly talk about Census Business Builder and some of the changes that have just been made in version 3.1. Which was released a couple of months ago, and what's coming in version 3.2. Now, Census Business Builder provides access to some selected statistics from the Census Bureau and from other agencies. So I'm going to jump back out over to my census.gov website, and I'm going to go to census.gov here. And I'm going to do a quick demo of the small business edition of Census Business Builder. So to get to CBB, we're going to click on Explore Data, and then Data Tools and Apps. And then after I choose Data Tools and Apps, I'm then going to click on Census Business Builder. And then I'm going to go ahead and click on the icon for the Small Business Edition. So let's say we were interested in researching the healthcare sector in Oregon, and I specifically wanted to look at home healthcare. We know that there are areas of Oregon where population doesn't have access to a major hospital in some more rural areas, so perhaps home healthcare services might be a way of helping to address those healthcare needs. So if I'm interested in sort of researching the home healthcare industry, I can choose that industry. Then we can choose a geography. I'm going to choose Multnomah County. And then once we choose the geography and go to the map, the application is now going to zoom in on Multnomah County. Let me zoom out a little bit more. And it's going to now present a couple of key statistics for me about Multnomah County. Right away, we have data on total population, but you can also look at data broken out by age, race, and ethnicity. There's socioeconomic data like household income, educational attainment, disability status, et cetera. And there's some housing statistics on the number of housing units, owner versus renter occupied, house values, owner costs, things like this. These variables are all from the American Community Survey, And in version 3.2, which is coming out at the end of October, we will be adding about another dozen ACS data variables to CBB. We get a lot of feedback on this tool from users saying, Andy, I really like this, but I wish that you would add X. And we honestly listen. So we are adding a bunch of data variables, including, for example, here, data on internet access is being added under the housing characteristics. We're adding some data on language spoken at home other than just simply Spanish. We're adding the Asian breakout and the Indo-European language breakout as well, based upon user feedback. Now, that feedback also impacted the business data that we release. For a number of years, we've had annual business data from county business patterns and non-employer statistics that's available here. About a year or so ago, we added some data from our international trade program, but we had a lot of feedback from users saying the Census Bureau doesn't publish data on wages, and I would really like wages data. BLS does. Could you guys incorporate the Bureau of Labor Statistics quarterly census of employment and wages into your tool? We did. So here is access to the BLS QCW data. Data are shown not only at the level for different levels, the actual estimates, but you can look at the data by change, both numeric change and percent change, and they've even incorporated the location quotients. So if you want to see how a certain area compares to a neighboring community, you can do that as well. At the Census Bureau, we conduct a program called the Quarterly Workforce Indicators, QWI. We've had a lot of interest in incorporating QWI data into CBB, so we did that about a year or so ago, but just recently we added some additional breakouts. These little arrowheads that are next to the Map Variables menu, when I click on those, I can then expand to more detail. So if you wanted to look at the employment data, but you wanted to see that data broken out by the worker's age, that data is now available in here. And if you're interested in hires data, how many people were hired by the home health care business, and you wanted to then see that by educational attainment, that data is now broken out as well. This is a really interesting tool for folks who are maybe have their high school education, haven't yet gone to college, and are kind of considering what might the job look like. Do they really need to get a full-blown bachelor's degree to be able to work as a home health care aide, or could they just get away with a high school education or associate's degree? By looking at the data, they could then see, well, in home health care, maybe you don't need, based upon the number of hires, maybe you don't need a full-blown bachelor's degree. Maybe an associate's degree or just a high school education is sufficient. Building permits data was added about 2 years ago. We keep updating the statistics in here as well. And we've also recently expanded the consumer spending data that's in Census Business Builder. These statistics come to us from Esri. They will gladly sell you the data themselves for $10,000. We included the data in this tool for you for free. And then finally, CBB does give you the ability to upload your own data using the My Variables feature. So those are really sort of the main changes to Census Business Builder. Of course, the data are not only available at the county level, but they're also available by city and town. So here's the data at the city and town level. Here is some population statistics available by zip code. And as you can see, we even now have data in Census Business Builder by census tract. Some of you may love this very colorful map color palette. Other ones may be saying, yikes, it's scary. I can't really tell what the big numbers are, what the small numbers are without looking at the legend. Yes, you can change the color palette to a more traditional light to dark. So dark values, dark colors being higher values, the light colors being the lower values. There's also a filter feature where I can go in and narrow these tracts that are displayed on the map to meet certain criteria. So let's say I want to find all the census tracts that have a high percentage of people who are over 65, who are disabled, who have health insurance coverage, and who have median household income over a certain dollar amount. I can go in and filter on those 4 characteristics, and just those geographies that meet my needs, that meet my criteria, would then be displayed. And then the last thing that I want to show you is, of course, you can not only look at the data on the screen and download the map data, but I can also go ahead and create a report from Census Business Builder, and this report then aggregates all of that demographic, socioeconomic, housing, and business data into one nice, clean, fully manipulable, downloadable, bookmarkable report. If from a bookmarking perspective, if you save this URL here in the report, or if I save the URL here in the map, and then come back to that URL later, maybe I send it to a colleague of mine or share it with a friend, when they click on that link, they'll come right back to this map exactly where I left them. Same variable chosen, same zoom level, same everything. So essentially, those are the main updates that I wanted to provide to you all. Let me get back out to my PowerPoint presentation and just provide a very quick summary. I know we're getting close to my time. Economic Census is a pretty amazing program. It has a real wealth of business data. We're about a little more than halfway done with all of the data from the Economic Census. So I would encourage you guys to check out the product lines data when they come out on November 19th. And again, use those resources that I mentioned about geography and industry changes whenever you're doing any kind of comparison of any data over time. The COVID hub is changing almost on a daily basis. Literally right before this call today, I had a meeting with our folks from Esri to talk about how we are planning on expanding the COVID hub to include that community resilience estimates program that I mentioned. We haven't incorporated yet into a dashboard. That'll be coming probably in about 3 weeks. So it'll be a nice place to get that data. And Census Business Builder is sort of my baby. Some of you know that I'm the project lead for CBB and chief designer, engineer, troublemaker on Census Business Builder. So if you have comments on it, if you'd like some additional training on Census Business Builder, please feel free to contact me. Here is my email address and my phone number. As you can tell, I'm not shy. So if you have any questions on any of the data that I talked with you all about today, or Census Business Builder or the COVID-19 Hub, you are more than welcome to email me. That is my office phone number. Unfortunately, I have not been in that office since the beginning of March, but it does roll over to my personal, or my Census cell phone. So with that, I am done. Heidi, did we have any questions in the chat?
No, we haven't received anything yet. So if you do have a question, we still have a few minutes to go ahead and enter that in the chat. And then, Andy, I did want to ask, you mentioned a couple of things about some of the variables you'll be adding to CBB. And so what's the timeline for 3.2?
So version 3.2 is scheduled to be released on October 27th. And right now, I can give you, since you're asking, Heidi, what are the variables that we've added. We've added data on the number of vehicles that are available to the household. FEMA specifically asked for that because when you think about the ability for people to evacuate an area, people who don't have a vehicle available, have 0 vehicles available, would have a harder time of getting out of their neighborhood if a disaster were to occur, a fire or a flood or a hurricane or a tsunami or whatever. So we are adding the no vehicles available, 1 vehicle available, 2 or more vehicles available. Internet access, broadband internet access accessibility is being added. We are adding the full breakout for language spoken at home. We are adding the data on median age. We are adding the breakout for the percent male versus percent female population, that one has been an interesting one because we've had questions about that over the years. And to me, it always seemed like a silly one to add because it's so often so close to 50-50. Why would it be valuable? But apparently it is. So we've added that one. And we added some more breakouts on the number of housing units. We have the owner versus renter occupied breakouts, but we didn't have the data on unoccupied, nor did we have the total number of housing units. So those have been added. We will also be updating the vintage of the quarterly workforce indicators and the QCW data. Those will both be representing first quarter 2020. Data will be updated. That's one of the really nice things of now releasing CBB 4 times a year instead of just twice a year, is that we now can update the quarterly data much more frequently. And we've even added some new data, international trade data on the continent that the products are being imported from or exported to. So if you wanted to know how many automotive parts were exported from the state of Oregon to Asia, that type of data is available to Census Bureau, and we're now adding that Asia breakout, for example, to CBB. And there's a few functional changes in there as well, some usability kinds of changes that people have commented on. Did I just see that Charles had a question too?
No, Charles said great stuff and thanks, but we did have another question come in, which I think we have time for one before we let you go. So it says, you describe business formation statistics. Is there a comparable business death statistic?
So the answer sort of is yes and no. If you're saying is there comparable weekly business deaths data, the short answer is no. We do publish data on business births, deaths, expansions, and contractions annually. When they changed BFS to add the weekly births type data, we did not do the same thing on the death side. And the simple answer to that is not really a simple answer, but the answer to that is, what is a business death? When you think about a business that has closed, maybe due to the COVID pandemic, how long does it need to be closed before you consider it closed? If the business shut down and was closed for a month, but then reopened, maybe new ownership came in and opened it, or maybe the family that had been running that business got some influx of capital and decided to reopen again. Would you have wanted to count that as a death when it first occurred? And honestly, we've had such a challenge in determining exactly what does everybody agree on what a business death is, that we just have decided to just leave it as annual data. So yes, we do have data. It's just not as timely as those births data are. Because again, when you get an EIN, you are by definition a birth. Your business has kicked off. So yeah, really good question.
Okay, great, Andy. So I think that was it that we had in the chat, but we're getting around 10. So if we want to, I guess, Charles, if you want to jump in and.
Sure. I just want to thank Andy for his presentation. And he was here in Oregon 4 years ago. It's amazing how Census Business Builder has developed since then. Amazing tool.
Right.
So thank you for that. And we're right on time, so we will come back in 10 minutes at 10 after.